Okay, so section 2.5, fiscal policy. So in the previous video, we had a look at monetary policy, and now we're having a look at fiscal policy. There is a third policy that governments have adopted in recent years. It's called quantitative easing, and that is all about money printing money. We're going to explore the effects of that on the macroeconomy later on in the course. And then more recently, this term has been thrown around. It's called quantitative tightening. And that's basically the reversal of quantitative easing. So later on in the course, we're going to learn all about quantitative easing, all about quantitative tightening, because quantitative easing in particular is having extraordinary impacts on the global economy, the Australian economy. Even housing prices in Australia are being impacted by quantitative easing. So it's a really interesting third policy. But before we get to that, we need to develop certain concepts and certain theories to fully understand QE. So we're going to focus on the second policy that the government can use to manipulate the aggregate demand curve. That's one thing worth keeping in mind. We've got three policies that the government typically implements at a macroeconomic level. The first is monetary policy, and we've got a fairly good idea of what that's about. The third is quantitative easing. That shifts the aggregate demand curve as well. And then fiscal policy. All of these three policies are designed to move the aggregate demand curve left or right. The government doesn't have a policy that it can implement to move the aggregate supply curve left or right. That's important to understand. So the aggregate supply curve is pretty much where it is. It's very difficult, if not impossible, for the government to implement any policy that's going to shift that left or right. Now, you might be thinking about, well, what if the government implemented an economy-wide subsidy? Wouldn't that shift the aggregate supply curve to the right? Well, I guess in some sense it would, but that is just not a credible policy. The government has never done that, nor has it ever considered subsidising every industry in the economy. And then that's got sort of flow-on effects of, well, where would that funding come from to get to be able to deliver the subsidy to every industry, every company in Australia to shift the aggregate supply curve to the right? So we don't want to start thinking like that. It's sort of thinking that's going to get us nowhere. So with the aggregate supply curve, the government doesn't have a policy to shift that, but it does have three policies to shift the aggregate demand curve left or right: monetary policy, fiscal policy, and QE. Now, more correctly, QE shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, but not to the left. So certainly monetary policy can shift the aggregate demand curve left or right, depending upon whether you are decreasing interest rates, which will shift it to the right, or increasing interest rates, which will shift it to the left. Fiscal policy can shift the aggregate demand curve left and right, and we'll learn more about that soon. But QE is more about just shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right, typically during severe downturns or recessions, and then QT will tend to shift the aggregate demand curve back to the left. Okay, so keep in mind, the key point here is the government can manipulate the aggregate demand curve, but it's got very little control over the aggregate supply curve. That's a really important thing to take away from this particular topic or subtopic of topic 2. So fiscal policy, we know we can use that to shift the aggregate demand curve left or right. It can't shift the aggregate supply curve. Even if you use fiscal policy to subsidise the R&D and new technology development, yes, that's going to shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. Start that again. If fiscal policy gave tax breaks to R&D and development of technology, yes, that would shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. But the point is, it's going to take years and years and years for that research and development and the technology to actually come through the system. And what we're interested in is using this model to explain short-term fluctuations in economic activity. That is the business cycle. So if you're talking about fiscal policy, maybe tax breaks for companies, if they undertake R&D or acquire some sort of new technology, then yes, that's fiscal policy. If it's a tax break, it would shift the aggregate supply curve to the right eventually, but probably over 3, 4, 5, 10 years. And so even though fiscal policy can shift the aggregate supply curve to the right in that sense, it can't shift it. Fiscal policy or any of these policies we're talking about can't shift the aggregate supply curve quickly enough to influence the shape and the magnitude of the business cycle. Okay, so let's just assume that over the course of the business cycle, the government really can't affect, in the short term, the aggregate supply curve very much at all. So recall here that the aggregate demand curve is made up of 4 different types of spending. Okay, so what that means is that at an inflation rate of 2.5%, we're at point B, and aggregate demand at that point is $2 trillion. Aggregate supply, the production side of the economy, is $2 trillion as well. Now, obviously, this is suggesting if the price level sort of, and I am using the price level and the inflation rate interchangeably. Just a quick recap of why I'm doing that. Technically, this model does have the price level on the vertical axis. Okay, but to understand, to help this model make sense when you're trying to apply it to real economic events in the real world, it's sometimes worthwhile just switching our minds over and interpreting these numbers on the vertical axis as the inflation rate. So when I'm actually explaining the model and explaining the operation of it, it's probably easier for me to talk in terms of the price level. It makes more sense that way. But just keep in mind, when the aggregate demand curve does shift to the right, it makes more sense that the inflation rate increases rather than the price level increasing. Because the price level is going up pretty much every year. Doesn't matter, even if the aggregate demand curve shifts left, chances are in that year, the price level will still increase, which is counterintuitive to this framework with the price level on the vertical axis. So in summary, this model makes sense. The model itself makes most sense if you consider the price level on the vertical, but very often when we're trying to apply this model to real world events, we'll just do a little sleight of hand and change the interpretation of the vertical axis to the inflation rate like I've been doing. There's no real problem with doing that. We're just doing it to make the use of this model a little bit more closely related to economic events. Okay, so we've got the aggregate demand curve, aggregate supply curve. Just keep in mind that aggregate demand is made up of C plus I plus G plus NX. So at point B, the total of these 4 categories of expenditure will be $2 trillion. So consumption spending might be 1.4 trillion. Investment spending might be sort of 300 billion, et cetera, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so let's start off at point A. And at point A, we're kind of in, well, we are in a trough, or we're in a contraction phase. So we've got an output level of, say, $1.9 trillion. That's well below potential output, well below the full employment level of output. And the inflation rate's a little bit low as well. We know that the central bank, the Reserve Bank of Australia, targets the inflation rate in this country to range between 2% and 3%. So what I'm kind of indicating there is point B would be a nice place to be for the economy. Full employment output of 2 trillion, that's this nice comfortable level of output where the economy is not producing too much, it's not producing too little. And at the same time, with this nice comfortable level of inflation. Of course, we don't know the exact value of potential output, but the unemployment rate gives us a little bit of an idea. If we have an output level that is very low, the unemployment rate's going to be very high, 5, 6, 7%. If the output level is beyond 2 trillion, maybe 2.1 trillion, the unemployment rate's going to be incredibly low, maybe 3%. So if we've got an unemployment rate of close to sort of, let's say 4% in Australia, then we can be reasonably confident that we're somewhere close to potential output. So 4%, that number is, you talk to different economists and you'll get a different unemployment rate that is consistent with potential output. But a lot of people are sort of saying around 4%, maybe 3.8 these days. Okay, so yes, we don't know the actual value of real GDP at potential output, but the actual unemployment rate will help us understand if we're close or not. And if the unemployment rate's 4%, roughly, we're probably going to be somewhere close to potential output. So what happens is the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. Why? Could be a range of different reasons, but the aggregate demand curve shifting from AD1 to AD0 is just a negative economic shock to the system. One or more components of expenditure have dropped to cause this leftward shift. So it could have been a slump in housing prices. If that's the case, housing investment will fall, so I will fall. And just think about it. You bought a house and the value of that house hit $3 million. And now all of a sudden it's worth 2.5 because prices across the country have slumped. What are you going to do? Enough people will respond to a negative shock to housing prices by actually cutting their consumption spending and increasing their savings to make a difference. So if housing prices across the country slump, consumption spending is also going to go down. People will stop borrowing and money and building new houses because the price is falling, the market's in a bit of a slump, so I will fall as well. So maybe it was a collapse in housing prices that caused this leftward shift through a reduction in C and I. So what you slowly need to be able to do is develop an understanding of which of the 4 components of aggregate demand will respond to certain shocks. So if I said to you, a mining boom occurred or is occurring, then you need to be able to think to yourself, okay, we export mining related commodities, so net exports will increase, and also investment spending by the mining companies might increase as well if they have, but if they've got enough capacity to satisfy the boom in exports, they may not need to undertake significant amounts of new investment. So yeah, that's a little bit tricky. A recession, for example. Well, in a recession, consumption spending is going to fall because you might lose your job. Investment spending may fall because you own a restaurant and you don't renovate that restaurant because the customers aren't coming in because we're in recession. And so C and I are typically going to go down during a recession. Net exports, that's X minus M. Imports are likely to go down during a recession as well. So during a recession, you lose your job. What import do you now not buy? Well, a foreign holiday is an import. So you lose your job during a recession, you don't go on that foreign holiday because you don't have the income flow, and so M goes down. Would exports change? Exports from Australia to other countries during a recession? Probably not, only if those countries were in recession too. But that's not the situation I'm considering. I'm just considering a recession in Australia. What happens? C will definitely go down. I will definitely go down. We've been in enough recessions to know that this happens. And imports will probably go down. Well, they will go down as well. Okay, but just keep in mind, imports aren't a component of aggregate demand, but I'm just stating that imports will go down. Remember, imports aren't a component of aggregate demand. Why? Because if you buy a $500 pair of Italian shoes, it's included as a type of consumption spending. It's also included in imports. Remember, NX is X minus M, exports minus imports. So the $500 pair of shoes are also included in M. So they cancel out. You've got $500 added under C, you've got $500 added under M, but M's got a minus sign in front of it. So the imports don't actually affect aggregate demand. Just keep that in mind. So a recession is going to drive down C&M, but it's useful to be able to think through a recession reducing imports as well. It'll become important, that will become important later on in the course, even though it's not relevant for this particular aggregate demand curve. Okay, and I'll explain why later in the course. Okay, so let's just imagine we end up at point A. What does the government do? Well, the government is probably going to hit the economy with some pretty aggressive monetary policy, lower interest rates to try to shift this aggregate demand curve back to the right. But very often, those lower interest rates will need to be supported by what we call expansionary fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is just the manipulation of government spending G and government taxation T. Expansionary fiscal policy is used in this case because the word expansionary means that the policy should expand the economy. Think of it that way. So if you want to adopt a fiscal policy that takes this aggregate demand curve AD0 and shifts it back to the right, you are actually going to increase the level of real GDP. That expands the size of the economy, so it's an expansionary fiscal policy. So what sort of actions can the government take to use fiscal policy and shift this aggregate demand curve from AD0 to AD1? Easy. Either increase government spending or reduce taxation. Think about that. If you increase government spending, you're increasing this variable G. You're increasing the value of it from maybe 200 billion to 220 billion. That will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Okay, and remember, the rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve also incorporates the multiplier effect that acts on the increase in government spending. So if government spending increases by 20 billion, then this rightward shift might be 100 billion if the multiplier is equal to 5. Or the government can cut taxes. So I guess the first question is, well, which taxes are they going to cut? Let's just imagine it is the income tax, the income tax paid by households. So they cut taxes on income. That straight away is going to give people more disposable income. Your disposable income is your income minus your taxation. It's called disposable income. And so if taxation falls, then income minus taxation, that value increases, so your disposable income increases. And with more disposable income, chances are consumption spending will go up a little bit. Or the government may do both an increase in T and a decrease in T. Sorry, an increase in G and a decrease in T. They may do both if the recession that the economy is in, and we're assuming the economy is in recession at point A, is particularly severe. So if it's particularly severe, the government may need to, in an attempt to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, lower interest rates using monetary policy, increase government spending, and cut taxes using fiscal policy, and also, if it's really severe, implement this third policy I've been talking about called quantitative easing. I don't want you to read up on QE yet. I just want you to appreciate that it exists. Monetary policy, fiscal policy, and QE can all be used. And that's exactly what happened in 2020 and 2021 in this country. All three policies were used in response to the COVID-19 recession that we went into in early 2020. This is pretty drastic stuff. You've got to appreciate that. Think about it. 2 years ago, we went into a COVID recession. A lot of people were losing their jobs. The government came along, or the central bank and the government came along, cut interest rates, the official interest rate, to 0.1. Now, I've been studying, teaching, researching economics for, 38, 39 years, in my lifetime, the cash rate has never been that low. It's never been 0.1% before. This is pretty radical, desperate stuff. At the same time, the government, over the last 2 years, massively increased government spending and cut taxes to try to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. It also implemented this third policy that we'll learn about called QE. It hit the economy with everything that it had in an attempt to shift this aggregate demand curve to the right during the COVID downturn. That is, in an attempt to get people out spending more. Now you might be thinking, well, how can people spend more if they're sort of locked away in lockdowns? Yeah, good point. It was very difficult. But that aside, they hit the economy with everything they had. So monetary policy, fiscal policy, and this policy we'll learn about called QE, you might be wondering what the fourth policy is. There is no fourth policy. We haven't found an effective fourth policy. So we were hitting the economy. We have been hitting the economy over the last 2 years with everything we've got. There was pretty much no stone left unturned in terms of what actions could be taken to try to stimulate spending. So as I've been saying, very interesting time when you get to the point where you've got to use everything you have to try to stimulate economic activity. And so what we're going to slowly explore in this course, well, we're going to explore so many things, but one of the things we're going to explore is why it was so difficult over the last couple of years to stimulate economic activity, to get people out and spending. And the answer is far more complex than they were or everyone was locked away. That doesn't cut it in terms of an answer. I mean, it was a temporary reason, but there's far more to it than that. Far more to it. So that'll hopefully be an interesting conversation when we get to that. So that's what fiscal policy is all about. You typically use it when the economy is to the left of potential output, when you're at a point such as point A, where the inflation rate is a little bit lower than desirable, where output is below potential output. And you use this policy, increases in government spending or decreases in taxation, to try to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Just remember, if you're cutting taxes, you're probably aiming, if it's a tax on households, people like you and me, then it's probably designed to boost consumption spending. You could reduce the corporate tax rate. That may encourage a little bit of investment, but think about this. Okay, so now we're cutting the corporate tax rate from 30% down to 20% during a severe recession. That's going to increase company profits. The question then becomes, well, what are they going to do with those profits? Some of those profits may be used to fund additional investment spending. But are companies going to undertake additional investment spending during a recession? Difficult one to answer. Probably not. Maybe a little bit of additional investment spending, but possibly not a lot. What are we talking about? A cut in the corporate tax rate. What happens? Well, the company's got more profit. What are they going to do with the profit? Probably not increase I. Well, it's possible, but any increase in I is probably not going to be large. There are a couple of other options. The companies could use this additional profit to pay down debt. Typically, all companies have borrowed money. They could use the profits to pay back some of that debt, or they could use the higher profits following the cut in the corporate tax rate to increase the amount of dividends they pay to households or to the owners of the company, which are typically households. So then what are the households going to do with those additional dividends? Possibly increase their consumption spending. So if you cut taxes, what I'm trying to get at is the variable that is most likely to respond is consumption spending. Even if you cut taxes for corporates, businesses, chances are that will just increase their profits and increase their dividend payouts, which will boost consumption spending, because who owns companies? Individual people own the companies through their holdings of shares. Okay, now a lot of these ideas, you've probably got questions in your mind about things that I'm saying, you know, sort of, yeah, that's okay, Paul, but what about this? Or there's probably a lot of things that are popping up in your mind. What I'll be doing is holding online Q&A sessions where you can come online and ask me all of the questions that sort of pop into your mind about what I'm saying about the economy, what's going on at the moment at the newspapers, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll be able to ask me anything in these Q&A sessions. So if you do have little questions as we go through, just write them somewhere on the slide, remember them, and ask me during one of the online Q&A sessions. So that's pretty much what fiscal policy is about, an increase in government spending or a cut in taxes. Of course, if the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, the government could do the opposite to shift the aggregate demand curve back to the left. It could cut government spending or increase taxes. Okay, that's how it works. Now, the government budget balance. Just like a household, just like you or me, the government has expenditure and it has revenue. Its revenue is its taxation revenue. Now, of course, the government does have other forms of revenue other than taxation revenue, but we're going to keep it simple. There's no point in going through an exhaustive list of all the tongue-tied here. There's no point in going through an exhaustive list of all of the sources of government revenue. You can go away and look that up yourself. It's going to add very little value to what we're doing. So we're just going to say T, it is the main source of government revenue, taxation revenue. We're just going to assume that for simplicity, that's the only source, and just ignore the others. So taxation, we've got GST revenue, we've got income tax revenue, corporate tax revenue, et cetera, et cetera. And government spending, well, what does government spend money on? Public goods, such as highways, lighthouses, public recreation spaces. They spend money on defence, education, social security, health, all of those sorts of things. Now, the government will run a budget surplus if over a period of time, typically a year, its taxation revenue is greater than its spending. Budget, think about that. If it's earning more revenue than it spends, it will be running a surplus. It'll have money left over at the end of the year. What will it use that money for? Typically, it will use it to pay down debt. They're not going to take this surplus and find other uses for it. Typically, they're not going to take the money and build another lighthouse, because if they needed another lighthouse, that lighthouse should already be in their budget. So hopefully they're not going to take the surplus and just waste it. So most governments, if they run it, will find other ways or other reasons to spend that money. Hopefully they're not going to do that. So if they're running a surplus, then they will typically use that money to pay down debt. So in the case of Australia, that surplus could be $2, $3, $4 billion. So they'll pay down their debt. Yes, the government does have debt. Just like corporates, just like households, the government has debt. In some countries, it's considerable. And we'll look at US government debt. That's, wow, that's a story in itself. We'll look at that later on in the course. The government will run a budget deficit when taxation revenue is less than government spending. And it needs to then finance the deficit by borrowing money. Now, I won't tell you how they do that, not yet, but we'll get to that in topic 3 and 4. We'll find out how the government borrows money, the debt markets that they access to borrow money, the interest rates on those debt instruments, et cetera, until you understand how governments borrow money, debt markets, and the interest rates on that debt, it's impossible to understand this radical policy called QE that governments around the world have been using. Quantitative easing, money printing. Sounds pretty exciting. So we've got budget deficit. So I found this in the RBA chart pack. It shows you the government budget balance. So these negative columns here, we've got the zero line. So the negative columns are government budget deficits. The positives are surpluses. Okay. Now, prior to the COVID recession in 2020, the last recession we had in Australia was 1990-91. We went into a big recession. That's it there, 1990-91. Look at the subsequent deficits that were run. I'm looking at all of this. Big, large deficits. These would have been deficits to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. For what? 6 years before the government budget went back into balance. These deficits, so these green negative values here, these budget deficits occurred because government spending was greater than taxation. Well, why would government spending be greater than taxation just after this recession? Easy, because the government was trying to shift the aggregate demand curve back to the right to return the economy to potential output, to full employment. And so after this recession of 1991, the government was doing this, increasing its spending, reducing its taxation to try to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And that was then producing these big budget deficits, which were then financed through through borrowing, through government borrowing. Then we had the mining boom. That started around 2003. I went through that a couple of videos ago. And look at what happened during the mining boom. Big surpluses. Well, that makes perfect sense to me, because during a big boom, there's more economic activity, more employment, income levels are rising. So what's going to happen to T? We've got surpluses here. So what's going to happen to T and G? So these surpluses, the second line, budget surplus. So during a big mining boom, what's going to happen to taxation revenue? Well, it's going to go up. Why? Because corporate profits will be higher. Companies will be paying, because they're earning more profit, they'll be paying more tax. Income levels go up, wages go up. So individuals will be paying more income tax. So naturally, during a boom in economic activity and expansion, for example, well, an expansion is just another word for boom, isn't it? Taxation goes up. And then government spending, that naturally goes down because unemployment levels are lower. So unemployment benefit payments are lower. So G goes down. At the same time, during a boom, the government may not want to overheat the economy. So it may decide to delay an infrastructure project until the economy is back to potential output so that it doesn't add to the inflationary pressure. So a couple of very good reasons why during a boom like this, like the mining boom 2003, 2009, the government will sort of naturally swing into surplus. Then this is 2000, look at this, 2000, it's hard to know exactly where these are lining up, but this is going to be this, for a switch from surplus to deficit, that's going to be the global financial crisis in 2008. So that, I would guess that that number there would be 2008, and this would be 2007, just before the GFC. GFC hit. Economies around the world went into recession. We didn't. We dodged a little bit of a bullet there in Australia. Chinese demand for Australian commodities held up over this period, just after the GFC. So we didn't quite go into recession, but one of the things that kept us out of the recession was large increases in government spending and decreases in taxation right after the GFC. That shifted the aggregate demand curve to the right. The government ran government budget deficits because G went up, T went down just after the GFC, and look at all these budget deficits. So a massive buildup of debt. So we got through the GFC. We were okay in this country. Certainly hit America and Europe much harder than us. And then we sort of were bumping along for quite a few years, thinking things were moving along quite nicely. 2019 didn't look too bad, and then 2020 hit. I don't need to tell you what happened then. You were all affected by it, locked away. All those places that you like to go on a weekend were closed for, even if it was just a couple of weeks. It was very difficult to go out and spend money. The Australian economy went into the 2020 COVID recession, and look what happened. The government responded by running deficits again. So they increased government spending, cut taxes to try to shift the aggregate demand curve back to the right. So a couple of very large deficits here. This will be 2020, this will be 2021. Actually, these are run on financial years, not calendar years. So that's probably, what would that be? Could be 2019, 2020. And this might be 2020, 2021. Okay, we don't really need to know exactly which column is which year. It's the principle that the theory, the ideas that we need to come to terms with. Now, to be honest, what year that column is, don't really care. Okay, if I want to know that, I get the original data, plot it and work it out. That's not what we're doing here. We're just trying to get this principle of what fiscal policy is across. And look at what the forecast is. From this solid line onwards are forecasts. And the Australian Treasury are forecasting quite large budget deficits right through to the middle of this decade. All of this will be a buildup of government debt. And government debt is forecast to get higher and higher and higher. Now, the interesting part of this is someone's going to have to pay that. It's going to have to be paid back. And the government debt that Australia is accumulating will be paid back through future government budget surpluses. And this debt that was accumulated after the GFC, that'll have to be paid back as well. All of these deficits add to government debt, and government debt in this country is getting higher and higher and higher. It's just over $1 trillion. So how do you pay that back? Well, in the future, you run government budget surpluses. So you either increase taxation or decrease government spending in the future. There are other ways to kind of deal with government debt, but basically you've got to run surpluses and pay that debt down with the surplus funds. So the interesting question is, well, who's going to pay that back? Well, it won't be me. I'll be retired by then. See where I'm going with this? If it's not me, who is it? Yeah, you got it. So it's going to be future generations. And that's the reality. That's the world we live in. So that may sound, that last sort of thing that I said there about future generations paying back the debt incurred to stimulate aggregate demand right now and in previous years, may sound very unfair. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's how you think. I appreciate that. I've got sympathy for that view. But that's the way the world works. That's the way the macroeconomy works. Okay, so that is fiscal policy, and we'll leave it there. Now, once again, with monetary policy, we're going to go through that in substantial detail. with fiscal policy, we're going to go through it in more detail, but not as much as we're going to explore fiscal policy. Why? Because fiscal policy is much more complicated. Sorry, monetary policy is much more complicated than fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is easy. I could kind of summarize that in 20 minutes. Monetary policy, it's much more complicated. And then we are going to learn about that third policy called quantitative easing. And once we go through that, you'll be one of a very small group of Australians who actually know what it is. A lot of people think they know. I've had friends think they know what QE is, and they try to explain it to me, and I'm sitting there thinking, that's not the way it works. So you'll be one of a very small group of people who understands what QE is. And then quantitative tightening, which is the reversal of QE. Well, hardly anyone understands what that is, but you will. And we'll get to that as we move through the course. So hopefully you're getting a feel for what the course is all about now. Very contemporary. We're figuring out what is going on in the Australian economy right now. We will increasingly look at what's happening in the global economy by looking at countries such as the US, Europe, Japan, and how it all fits together. It's a course which is focused very much on you understanding the world around you and developing the theory that you need to help you do so. Okay, so that's the end of topic 2, and next we'll move on to topic 3.